In Ukraine, soldiers defending their country have not left the battlefield for the past 2 years. In Kyiv, a tough law is about to be brought in that would see conscription apply to younger recruits. This has started a public disagreement between President Zelensky and his army general Zelensky. Our writer Svitlana Morenets has covered this for the magazine this week. She joins me now with war historian Antony Beevor. Svitlana, you write for the magazine this week about the Ukrainian army and growing internal disagreements about conscription. Tell us about what's happening between President Zelensky and his top general.
First of all, we have ended in the situation when Ukraine is entering the third year of the full-scale war, and we don't have enough soldiers in our army. So our army commander Zelensky, he offered that this year Ukraine has to conscript up to 500,000 people, while Zelensky said that Ukraine can't afford it because conscripting this amount of people will cost at least £10 billion. And it's only for paying their salaries, clothing, food, equipment, and training. Ukraine can't use the Western aid for paying for soldiers. And also, our budget deficit this year is at least £30 billion. So he said Ukraine can't afford this amount. That's why right now there are talks that Zelensky wants to fire Zelensky and find a new commander-in-chief, and he hopes that the new person will give a fresh start for Ukraine's war effort.
You mention in your piece that in the Second World War, the average age of combat was 26. In the Falklands, it was 23. For a Ukrainian soldier, it's 43. I think that's going to surprise a lot of people. A clear decision has been made so far to conscript a slightly older generation to keep the young people at home and working and keeping the economy afloat. But is that about to change?
Yes, right now, before the minimum conscription age was 27, and with the new law, they are going to lower it to 25. And also all the men aged from 18 to 24, they will have to undergo a military training for 5 months. And of course, it is more efficient to have younger people in the army, and they can be trained by our Western allies and become drone operators, or they can work in intelligence, communication. That's why before they conscripted older people because they thought, okay, younger will stay and rebuild the country after the war ends.
Antony, as Svitlana has suggested, this is miles apart from other wars in the way that conscription has taken place. What's the strategy here, and how does it compare to the past?
Well, it's very different, as she rightly pointed out, between, the Second World War and the Falklands and so forth. And in many ways, I think it was an intelligent move at the beginning. But quite honestly, the pressure of events has actually changed considerably. And I think that Zelensky is not facing up to the facts on the ground. And I think that General Zelensky is absolutely right. And if you leave it too long, the crisis is actually going to get far worse. If you start throwing in basically untrained troops at the last moment, you're going to face massive losses, because it's not just a question of the training. It's a question of how you introduce these young recruits, or much younger recruits, into the front line. And what they must do is learn from the terrible mistakes made by the British and the Americans in Normandy, where these soldiers were thrown forward and unprepared, and most of them had psychological breakdowns. The casualties in their first few days were terrible. And the established troops, the trained troops, who were the vital ones, didn't want to have anything to do with the young ones who were arriving. They basically shunned them, which made the situation even worse. So it is terribly important, as I say, to have mentors who will look after them in their first few days in combat. And I think this is the real lesson that basically Ukraine should learn from our mistakes in the Second World War.
Antony, what do you make about that point about spending £10 billion is a lot of money in the UK, but in a country like Ukraine, I think that amounts to roughly a quarter of government spending at the moment? Seeing as they can't move military aid around easily, how are they going to find the money to bring on these younger recruits?
Well, one of the problems is that for various complicated reasons, they cannot use foreign aid in paying troops, or they should be able to equip them all right. But the point is, I think they're trying to do perhaps too much too quickly. They've got to start doing it, and I think this standoff between Zelensky and Zelensky is tragic at this particular moment, because this is where some form of compromise has got to be found. But the economic one is a very, very difficult one. Yes, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's absolutely vital for Ukraine's survival.
The issue is that the lack of men on the front line has already started to take a toll on the battlefield. And last week, Russian forces already entered Avdiivka, a city in the Donetsk region that they were trying to capture for a decade. They also prepared 40,000 troops to try to capture Kupiansk in Kharkiv region, and only 20,000 Ukrainian troops will be there to defend the city. And soldiers I've been talking to who are preparing for the fight or who are already fighting, all of them say that they need more troops, they need reinforcements, they are tired, they have been fighting for 2 years, and they can't understand why why should it be only they war, why other men don't join.
Svitlana, you've spoken there about how the soldiers currently feel. How will Ukrainian families feel when the conscription numbers go up and when their sons, when the younger members of their family are going to be sent to the front line?
Of course, nobody wants to go to war, nobody wants to die. It's the decision that Ukrainians and our government have to make. Or we fight, or we talk with Russia. And at the moment, nobody wants to talk with Russia, and all our opinion polls show that Ukrainians are not ready for any negotiations, because we know what comes after that Russian occupation and all the horrors that it brings. But at the same time, there is a big gap between civilians and soldiers, because civilians were hoping that the war could be won without them, because especially in the first year of this full-scale invasion, Zelensky and our government were talking that it's going to be the year of our victory, and it didn't happen, and a lot of people feel disappointed because of that.
Antony, there's increasing pressure on Ukraine from other countries around the world to enter into some kind of conversation with Russia, but we've heard Svitlana's comments there. If that is not considered an option for Ukraine right now, it is an inevitable outcome, isn't it, that more are going to be conscripted. They're going to have to find the money, but we are probably going to see cracks in the current plan as it exists now.
Well, I think that Svitlana, in her excellent article, points to many of the problems. I mean, the young, just like the former generation or earlier generations in the Second World War, are not just appalled by the prospect of military service, but this fear of being disfigured or maimed in battle is far greater, actually, than the fear of death. And, for example, in the Second World War, soldiers in the Red Army were terrified of becoming what were known as samovars, i.e. they'd lost all their limbs, and they were treated so badly afterwards. So it's not just a question of the money to find and pay and equip new troops. It's also a question of the money to look after the troops, especially those who've been badly wounded and maimed and lost limbs in the fighting. And I think this is one of the big problems which obviously Ukraine is facing.
Svitlana, what do you make of increasing pressure on Ukraine to come to the table with Russia and have a conversation, have a negotiation?
I think it is very unfair, because first, Ukraine, at the beginning of the invasion, Ukraine didn't receive enough weapons and support to liberate the lands. And recently was revealed that when Russian just took Melitopol, for example, and Zelensky said, okay, we are going to strike Melitopol and we're going to liberate it quickly, the West said, no, you are not allowed to do that, because we don't want to provoke Putin. And the chance was lost. And when the counteroffensive started and it didn't reach any goals, it was already too late, because Russians prepared, they had the minefields, they had defense lines ready, so Ukrainians couldn't do anything. And right now, as we couldn't achieve our goals because we didn't have air cover, for example, for our troops, now we are told, okay, we see that you can't liberate lands, then you must talk. And why Ukrainians don't want to talk now is because we are not in the advantageous position for negotiations. We can't set our terms, you know. If we had some victories on the battlefield, maybe then we could say, okay, look, we did this and did this, that's why our terms are like this and you have to comply with them, you know. But right now we can't, and if we talk with Russia now, it would be on Russia's terms how it ends. That's why Ukraine is not ready to do that.
Antony, last question. Almost regardless of what happens in this war next, Zelensky is going to need his most senior politicians and generals in his camp, on his side. And he has talked about a major reset. Should we expect to see some more shakeups in President Zelensky's top team, as there do seem to be increasing disagreements internally in Ukraine?
Well, I fear that may well be the case, and I think it's, as I was saying, tragic that it should be coming at such a time. This is, though, one of the problems in warfare, and especially for a democracy fighting a war. There are always going to be these sort of tensions. But I mean, you've only got to see on the other side. I mean, how many generals have been sacked by Putin during the earlier part of the war? Because they were not achieving what he had expected or what he had hoped. Well, we're starting to see similar pressures now in Ukraine. But I would add one thing also to what Svitlana was just been saying about the problems of negotiations. And that is, how can one trust anything that Putin says? This is one of the problems in the past when the West was dealing with communist leaders, either in China or in Russia during the Cold War. On the whole, they could be fairly certain that these communist leaders would stand by their assurances. This cannot be trusted anymore, and this is one of the real fundamental problems about the future of diplomacy, about geopolitics as a whole. If you cannot in any way trust what they say in negotiations. And let's face it, Putin wants to have, he would like to have a ceasefire for a time while he is bringing in new forces, preparing and basically redeploying his troops. He will then try and find some excuse just to continue the war so he can grab more territory. All of this makes any question of negotiation doubly dangerous for Ukraine.
I agree with Antony on that, because we had Budapest Memorandum with Russia, we had 2 Minsk agreements with Russia, and Russia, both of them didn't work. Russia attacked Ukraine, and in 2014, when they invaded Crimea and Donbass, we made that ceasefire, and in 8 years, Russia came back with stronger forces. And the fear right now is, okay, if we have a deal with Russia and Putin has time to prepare for the next invasion, maybe the next time Kyiv will fall and then it will be over for Ukraine. So while we have this chance that we can protect our lands and ensure that we bring back our territories, we have to use it.
Antony and Svitlana, thanks for joining Spectator TV.